The courtroom was silent, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Then it happened. A police officer, sworn to uphold the law, stepped forward with clenched fists and venom in his eyes. He wasn't being threatened. He wasn't under attack. He was just angry. Angry that the person behind the bench, commanding the room with nothing but her voice and dignity, was a black woman. And in front of stunned witnesses, he did the unthinkable. He punched her. But that was only the beginning. Welcome to Talecraft, where real stories are told like legends, because truth is stranger than fiction. If you're visiting us for the first time, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Here's a question for you. What happens when justice gets knocked down but chooses to rise with fire in her eyes? Because today's story is not just about a courtroom outburst, it's about a woman in a robe who refused to be silent, even when the system turned against her. The story begins in a packed courtroom on an unusually tense morning. Judge Imani Daniels, a woman known for her calm authority and deep fairness, was presiding over a case involving police brutality. One of the officers called to testify, Jacob Holt, came in wearing not just his badge, but his bias. What began as verbal disrespect escalated quickly. When Judge Daniels held him accountable, Holt crossed the line, stepping forward, calling her a slur, and throwing a punch heard across the country. But she didn't flinch. This isn't just a tale of violence in a courtroom. This is about power, who thinks they have it and who actually does. Judge Daniels didn't just survive the assault. She stood her ground, exposed the rot behind the badge, and held firm in the face of national controversy. Through viral videos, media storms, and public outrage, she didn't waver. And as we walk you through this story, you'll see how one woman's resilience turned a moment of humiliation into a movement of accountability. Because what happened in that courtroom didn't just challenge one woman's dignity, it challenged an entire system's foundation. It raised questions about race, respect, and responsibility in America's courts. And it proved one undeniable truth: when justice is attacked, it doesn't retreat. It fights back, with truth, courage, and a voice that echoes far beyond the gavel's final fall. Judge Imani Daniels was no ordinary judge. At 44, she had already presided over some of the most difficult cases in the state, always with fairness, patience, and an unwavering sense of dignity. Her courtroom was known for being one of the few places where every voice, regardless of race or class, felt heard. But beneath that calm exterior, she was also a former civil rights attorney. She had walked through marches, seen injustice firsthand, and made it her life's mission to uphold the law, all of it. That morning, however, she had no idea that justice would be tested right before her bench. The case seemed standard on the surface: a complaint filed by a black teenager who claimed to have been assaulted during a traffic stop. The officers involved insisted the force used was necessary, but there was video footage, grainy but damning. Judge Daniels had seen enough of these cases to know when something didn't add up. Among the witnesses was Officer Jacob Holt, a decorated veteran of the force with a reputation for being old school, which many quietly translated to dangerously prejudiced. His name had popped up before, always in cases with suspicious use of force complaints. When Holt walked into the courtroom, something shifted. His posture wasn't respectful, it was defiant. He didn't nod at the judge, didn't acknowledge the bailiff, and sat slumped in the witness chair like it was beneath him. As the questioning began, he grew irritated. When Judge Daniels reminded him to answer clearly and respectfully, he smirked and muttered, "You people always think you're in charge." A hush fell over the courtroom. Her clerk froze. The prosecutor's eyes widened. But Daniels remained steady. She asked him to clarify. He refused. And then, in front of a packed room, Holt stood and walked toward the bench. The bailiff shouted for him to sit down. He didn't. Holt pointed a finger at the judge and said, "You don't belong up there." That's when Judge Daniels pressed a hidden panic button under the desk, just in case. Holt kept walking. The courtroom erupted in voices. The bailiff moved to intercept. But before anyone could restrain him, Holt took one swing, a punch thrown from a place deeper than anger. It missed her jaw but grazed her shoulder. The courtroom went still, then exploded into chaos. But Daniels never left her seat. She stared him down, unshaken. Security tackled Holt to the ground as Judge Daniels adjusted her robe, eyes locked on the man who had tried to intimidate her through violence. The press was in the room too. Cameras clicked. Videos rolled. Within minutes, the footage had gone viral. "Racist cop punches black judge" was on every major news outlet by sundown. But Imani Daniels wasn't done. She ordered an emergency session of court to continue the hearing the very same day. She wasn't going to let his hatred delay justice. "This is exactly why I'm here," she said. "Because they think they can silence us." That day the courthouse didn't just witness an assault, it witnessed a woman reclaim power in real time. Holt was arrested and charged not only with assault, but with contempt of court and hate crimes. The very laws he had sworn to enforce were now turned against him. For Daniels, it wasn't about personal revenge, it was about principle. Her quiet strength in the face of violence reminded everyone watching that true authority isn't loud or violent. It's composed. It's measured. And most of all, it stands tall, even when the system tries to knock it down. The very next morning the courthouse parking lot was swarmed, not with officers but with people. Protesters gathered with signs bearing phrases like, "Justice for Judge Daniels," "We stand with her," and "No more cop privilege." The footage of Holt lunging at the bench had spread like wildfire across social media. It wasn't just the punch, it was what it represented. A white officer enraged at being challenged by a black woman in authority, acting as if the law didn't apply to him. But this time the world saw it all. There was no body cam debate. No blurred angle. Just unfiltered truth. In a matter of hours, major news outlets ran the story on loop. Talk shows buzzed with legal analysts and civil rights leaders dissecting every second of the courtroom footage. Twitter erupted with hashtags. Hashtag Imani Daniels, hashtag Black Women in Power, and hashtag Holt Must Pay. Civil rights attorneys called the act an assault on the justice system itself. Across America, judges, lawyers, and activists released public statements in support of Daniels. Even those who had once disagreed with her courtroom decisions now admired her composure. To sit still and unbroken after being physically attacked? That wasn't just strength. It was legacy-defining courage. But back at the courthouse, things were anything but quiet. Several officers from Holt's precinct were caught on camera discussing the incident. Some defending him, others quietly distancing themselves. An internal affairs investigation was launched almost immediately. Holt's badge was suspended, then revoked entirely within 48 hours. The chief of police, under pressure from the mayor's office, publicly condemned Holt's actions. But behind the scenes, rumors swirled. Holt had long exhibited signs of racial aggression, but complaints were buried. Daniels' case was not just about a courtroom outburst, it was about a department culture finally exposed. Meanwhile, Judge Daniels returned to court just 3 days later, refusing to take a leave of absence despite security concerns. When asked why she returned so soon, she replied with quiet resolve, "If I leave this seat, I hand it to fear. And fear doesn't get to win here." She installed more courtroom security and personally oversaw how proceedings would resume. The same courtroom where she'd been attacked now became the site of transformation. A black female judge, unshaken, issuing orders with the full force of law, underlined every time she raised the gavel. Across the country, people began to draw comparisons to past historical moments. Images of Rosa Parks refusing to move, or Ruby Bridges walking through angry mobs to integrate a school. But this wasn't history. This was happening in real time. Schools invited Judge Daniels to speak. Law students studied her case. And for young black girls watching from home, she became a new kind of superhero, not in a cape but in a robe behind a bench, daring to say, "You will not break me." Every insult Holt had ever thrown, every microaggression she'd endured, had all led to this moment of defiant clarity. Yet not everyone supported her. Certain media personalities attempted to reframe the story. She provoked him, they claimed. She had a history of being combative. Others called for her removal, insisting she set a tone of disrespect. But for every critic, thousands stood louder. Students staged walkouts. Black lawyers formed a national alliance to review past cases involving Holt. Civil rights organizations filed motions to unseal disciplinary records from his department. In one bold move, Daniels ordered her courtroom transcripts and security footage be made public. "Let the people see," she said. "Let them know what's really happening in our courts." Her boldness ignited a movement. Within a month, 3 more officers from Holt's department were investigated. 2 were suspended. 1 stepped down. Judge Daniels, once quietly respected, now stood at the center of a reckoning. She began pushing for mandatory racial bias training for law enforcement and judicial staff. A bill bearing her name was introduced in the state legislature, focusing on transparency and accountability in police departments. What began as a single punch became the spark for a legal uprising. And through it all, Daniels never asked for pity, only progress. Behind closed doors, though, Judge Daniels was human. In interviews she admitted the toll, the sleepless nights, the threats, the fear for her family. But she also spoke of faith, of knowing her ancestors had endured far worse so she could hold that gavel. "I didn't ask for this battle," she told one reporter, "but I'm ready to fight it." She wasn't just defending herself, she was defending the integrity of every black woman who had ever been told she didn't belong in power. And for Officer Holt, the shock was only beginning. Because in trying to break her, he had made her invincible. The deeper investigators looked into Officer Holt's record, the darker it became. Internal Affairs discovered that his personnel file had been quietly edited, several entries mysteriously missing or sealed without proper documentation. What was initially seen as a single moment of rage in Judge Daniels' courtroom now looked like the tip of a very large, very ugly iceberg. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse stretched back nearly a decade. One complaint, filed by a black teenage boy, detailed how Holt had slammed his head into a squad car after the boy asked, "Why are you stopping me?" The media began uncovering stories long buried by police bureaucracy. A Latina woman, now in her 30s, came forward anonymously. She recalled how Holt had once pulled her over and threatened to plant narcotics in her car when she questioned his tone. "He made me feel like my life didn't matter," she told a local reporter. Another man, a former sergeant who had worked beside Holt, confessed he'd once reported Holt's aggressive behavior to a superior, only to be transferred to another precinct weeks later. The pattern was chilling. Holt had been protected, enabled, and in Judge Daniels' courtroom he finally imploded. Court records showed that Holt had a tendency to escalate minor disputes, a history of belligerence toward people of color. Emails surfaced, Holt referring to certain neighborhoods as zoo zones. Body cam footage from previous arrests was reviewed. In one video he shouted at a crying black woman, "You people always play victim." These weren't isolated incidents, they were mile markers on a long road of unchecked bias. It became clear that Holt hadn't just lost his temper in court. He had brought his worldview into a place where justice was supposed to be blind, and tried to punch through it. Pressure mounted on the police department to explain how such a man kept his badge for so long. The police chief, flanked by legal counsel and city officials, gave a hollow press conference about institutional reform and re-evaluating internal protocols. But Judge Daniels didn't need rehearsed apologies. She needed action. And the community wanted accountability. Civil rights attorneys filed a federal lawsuit against the department for negligence and cover-ups. Parents began organizing town halls. Former officers testified that complaints against Holt were handled internally, which often meant quietly ignored. The blue wall of silence was finally cracking, because someone had dared to swing at justice. Meanwhile, a grand jury was convened to evaluate not just Holt's assault, but the entire web of departmental failure. Daniels, though still presiding over cases, now carried a different weight in the courtroom. Every gavel strike echoed with public expectation. She spoke candidly in a televised interview, "What happened in my courtroom didn't start there. It started years ago, when silence became policy." Her words resonated. Universities invited her to speak on legal reform. Young black law students called her a pioneer. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a symbol. And the man who tried to break her had become her unwitting amplifier. But perhaps the most unexpected revelation came from Holt's own family. His estranged sister gave an exclusive interview, revealing a history of radical ideology in their household. "We were taught fear," she said quietly. "Taught hate." Her words hit the airwaves like a bombshell. For once, it wasn't just about a rogue officer, it was about generational rot. Judge Daniels watched the interview in silence. Not with triumph, but with clarity. Holt had come from a world that told him he'd always be above the law. But the law, through her, finally pushed back. And now, the system that once shielded him was being dismantled brick by brick. The courtroom was packed the day the trial against Officer Holt began. Cameras lined the walls, reporters whispered into microphones, and spectators leaned forward, anticipating the fall of a man once protected by silence. Holt sat in his chair, jaw tight, dressed in civilian clothes that couldn't hide the weight of public scrutiny. Across the room, Judge Daniels, recused from this trial but watching from the gallery, sat with quiet resolve. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to witness justice work the way it should, without fear, without favor, and without the shroud of institutional corruption that once cloaked people like Holt. Prosecutors painted a picture that was both damning and undeniable. They played body cam footage of prior incidents, read email transcripts aloud, and put witnesses on the stand who had waited years, some decades, to be heard. Holt's defense attorney tried to argue he'd acted out of stress, claiming Daniels had provoked him by challenging his authority. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw through the bravado and the thin veneer of control. What they saw was a man unraveling because someone in a robe didn't fear his badge. And now that same badge offered no shield. After 3 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the air was thick with anticipation. The foreperson rose, voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Gregory Holt, guilty on all charges." Gasps rippled through the room. Some cried. Others clapped. Holt's expression cracked for the first time. He slumped back, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. The sentence was swift: 7 years in federal prison with no chance of early parole. But this wasn't just a conviction. It was a statement, to every officer, every institution, every courtroom. In the weeks that followed, real change began to surface. The police department announced an independent oversight board. Mandatory racial bias training was rolled out statewide. And more officers were quietly put under review, some removed entirely. Judge Daniels returned to her bench, where she delivered rulings with the same calm authority, but now with a broader purpose. She became a mentor to young lawyers of color. She hosted forums about justice and equity. Her courtroom was no longer just a place for verdicts. It had become a classroom for reform. A place where one punch turned into a movement. Outside that same courtroom, a mural was unveiled, painted by local youth. It showed a blindfolded Lady Justice, standing firm with cracked scales but an unbroken sword. Behind her, a woman of color, clearly inspired by Daniels, stood tall, fists unclenched, gaze unshaken. The mural's title? She didn't flinch. People gathered to take photos, leave flowers, write messages. One child, no more than 10, asked his mother, "Is that the lady who stopped the bad guy?" The mother nodded, eyes wet. And in that moment it was clear. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been reborn, in truth, in courage, and in a woman who refused to step back.